welcome to On This Day in Tudor History. I'm Claire Ridgway, I'm founder of the Tudor Society and Anne Boleyn Files websites, also author of several history books. Now I'm here with a rather yucky tale today. Now Henry VIII had died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. And it was on this day in history, the 14th of February 1547, just over 2 weeks later, that his coffin was taken to Windsor Castle for burial in St George's Chapel there, after resting overnight at Syon Abbey. It is said that while the coffin rested at Syon, that some liquid, decomposition fluid, I would assume, leaked out of it and onto the floor beneath. So the lead envelope that Henry's embalmed body was put in mustn't have been sealed properly, and this dripped out of the coffin and onto the floor beneath. In the 19th century, this tale comes from Agnes Strickland, who was writing in the 19th century, but she quoted from a primary source, she says, a contemporary document among the Sloane collection, as saying, "The king, being carried to Windsor to be buried, stood all night among the broken walls of Syon, and there the leaden coffin being cleft by the shaking of the carriage, the pavement of the church was wetted with his blood. In the morning came plumbers to solder the coffin, under whose feet, I tremble while I write it, was suddenly seen a dog creeping and licking up the king's blood. If you ask me how I know this, I answer William Greville, who could scarcely drive away the dog, told me, and so did the plumber also." So this contemporary source from the Sloane collection, this manuscript, whoever wrote this is saying that he heard this from William Greville, who had to get rid of the dog, and also the plumber that had been called in to solder it, and that the leaden envelope had been sort of damaged by the shaking of the carriage on the road. The dog coming underneath that coffin and licking up this decomposition liquid. Ugh. Now, the dog doing this was thought to fulfill a prophecy made by Franciscan Friar William Peto in 1532. Now, the friar was Princess Mary's confessor, and 1532, of course, is when King Henry VIII, he'd put Catherine of Aragon to one side, and he was moving on with his life, moving on to Anne Boleyn and trying desperately to get his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. On Easter Sunday of 1532, the friar preached a sermon, and in the king's presence, this was at the Franciscan chapel at Greenwich. And instead of focusing on the Easter story and the resurrection, he decided that he was going to speak on 1 Kings 22 from the Old Testament. Now, in this passage, the prophet Micaiah shares his prophecies with King Ahab. Ahab ignores these prophecies and imprisons Micaiah, but Ahab then dies from wounds inflicted during battle. And the Bible says, "So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria, and one washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood." The friar compared King Henry VIII to Ahab in his sermon and drew comparisons between Anne Boleyn and Jezebel, who was Ahab's wife, who had replaced God's prophets with pagan priests, just as Anne Boleyn was promoting the appointments of men of the Reformed faith, the new religion. And he concluded his sermon with a warning to the king. Peto said, "God's judgments were ready to fall upon his head, and that dogs would lick his blood as they had done to Ahab." Now, the friar did get into trouble for preaching this sermon in front of the king. You can imagine King Henry VIII being very, very annoyed by this sermon. And the friar was imprisoned for a few months and then sensibly left the country going into exile. And I think his life was saved by doing so. So this liquid leaking out of the king's coffin at Syon and being licked up by that dog on this day in Tudor history in 1547 was seen as a fulfilment, the fulfilment of Peto's prophecy. So I'm sorry to give you such a horrible on this day in Tudor history, and of course it's Valentine's Day, so you don't want blood and decomposition really. So I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia on Valentine's Day now, just to bring some love into the video. So put away that horrible story and let's have some nice stuff. Now, Valentine's Day is not a modern thing. It was known in the medieval and Tudor periods. Geoffrey Chaucer, who of course is known for his Canterbury Tales, wrote in the 14th century of how birds would choose their mates on Valentine's Day. So Valentine's Day was known, and that theme has been repeated in other pieces of literature too. In John Lydgate's 15th century poem, A Valentine to Her That Excelleth All, Lydgate writes of how it was custom on Valentine's Day for people to choose their love, to look and search Cupid's calendar and choose their choose by great affection. So it was known, it was talked about, and it was a day of love. Alison Sim, a historian who's written some wonderful books on social history, she's written a book called Pleasures and Pastimes in Tudor England, and she explains in there that the Tudors did celebrate Valentine's Day because it is mentioned 3 times in the Paston Letters, which were written in the 1470s. She explains that Valentines were chosen by lot from among a group of friends who then had to buy their Valentine a gift. So it's a bit like a secret Santa, choosing lots to who you would buy for. So you're not necessarily buying for your loved one, the person that you've fallen in love with. You're just buying from someone whose name you've picked out of a hat. And you might buy them a trinket or a piece of ribbon or a piece of fabric or something, just something little, to show friendship and love. Now, I had a browse through the Paston Letters because I wanted to see what these mentions were. And I found a letter written by Marjorie Bruce to John Paston in February 1477, which opened with, "Right reverend and worshipful and my right well beloved Valentine." And it then went on to include a poem. So she's calling him her Valentine in that letter. So it obviously had significance. And perhaps she wrote it on Valentine's Day as well. So Valentine's Day was known. But I love the idea of a kind of secret Santa for Valentine's Day. You know, if you haven't got a significant other, picking names out of a hat and making sure everyone has something is rather a nice thing to do. Anyway, I'm going to leave you on that theme, a theme of love and sweetness rather than how we started off this video. I hope you're enjoying these On This Day in Tudor History videos. You can subscribe by just clicking on that button, and if you want to be notified about new videos, then don't forget to hit the bell as well. Take care, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.